All right, I'm here with Danny Wicentowski, who reported on a wave of airplane hijackings in the 1960s and 1970s. And I'm less interested in the crime itself, more than I am in how journalists and government officials and psychologists tried to explain what was going on before they had a framework for it. All right, so let's talk about skyjacking.
Yeah.
What is skyjacking, and what was the golden age of skyjacking?
Skyjacking is a slang term for hijacking. It's a term that you started seeing in the 1960s and 70s. It was a word that I believe was invented or really only came into use because it is different when you hijack something on the ground versus when you hijack something in the sky. And this was a term that was used, I think, to describe this very strange, almost like criminal trend that took over a lot of like popular consciousness and a lot of fear from our airports and the way that we traveled in the late 1960s through the 1970s. This skyjacking could be a lot of different things, just like I think when we think about a way a crime can be committed. Is it for money? Is it because, is there something, is it convenience? Is it opportunity? And skyjacking was a crime that sort of combined all of these things, but also with this underlying national security kind of apocalyptic fear of that we all were relying on planes, stuffing hundreds of people into these tubes. Would it really just take one person to take control of that entire thing? Like, what could one person do with hundreds of lives, held in suspension?
Literally.
Yeah, like literally suspended in the air. I think there was this, a lot of, I think you can imagine, are they going to try to release political prisoners? Will they try to attack a government building? This was before 9/11, but I think there were worries that planes could be used as weapons. But overall, I think this is a kind of crime that we both don't really think about anymore at all, the style of 1960s and 70s skyjacking. But on the other hand, our entire modern life of air travel is defined by a terrorist attack that used planes as a weapon.
Okay, so to clarify, skyjacking is hijacking planes.
Yes. A skyjacker is just a hijacker with dreams. No,
They all have dreams.
Every
hijacker has dreams.
And so many different dreams. There were some who went to Cuba. There were ones who went to Cuba for different reasons. Some of them believed they had a religious obligation to go to Cuba and show the communists the glory of Christianity. Some of them went to Cuba because they were going to kill Fidel Castro. There were so many different reasons to skyjack a plane in this period in the 60s. And the thing is, most of them were political. There were people who had like a religious mania or just like a mania. Like they had a gun, they got a ticket, and that's all you need.
Going back to kind of like why this was happening, or like not even why it was happening, but what explanations people are coming up with for why this is happening. What explanations were the psychologists coming up with?
I think the place that I saw it earliest is this little blue book written by a psychologist in I think 1964, and this idea of like, is this a psychological problem? Is this a society issue, and not so much of like one person needing a few $1,000s? And so he interviewed a bunch of these hijackers, and you get these little character snippets of the type of person they are, and what they did, and this very reductive kind of a bad relationship with their mother, or flunked out of school
and just had to hijack a plane.
Yeah, like they were just trying to draw connections wherever they could. And this psychologist in this book actually produced the first real effort to combat skyjacking, and it was a psychological test that the ticket agents would basically be running down a checklist of, is this person traveling alone? Does this person seem to have a romantic interest? Some of these things sound practical, like do they have any luggage, but also like things about their temperament, about their place in society, their employment, a lot of presumptions about the type of person who was a criminal. And this psychological test was a massive failure. It did not catch these hijackers. It did not catch a number of skyjacking cases. You'll almost always see a reference in a news story that like the passenger was not flagged by this special psychological test. They were considered normal. There is this fundamental question of like why people skyjack planes, but it's also kind of the same question of like why does our brain, when we look over the edge, think like you could totally jump? Like that call of the void, like we move through life in ways that we recognize when a single decision, when we have the opportunity to make it, could break everything. Like it kind of gives us a sense of power, right? Like we could throw it all away at any moment. We have every opportunity to use gravity or the items around us, and it kind of like it's a mental health check almost. Like you recognize, obviously I'm not going to jump off this ledge, even though I could. Like it's kind of neat that I physically could move. I think I could physically move my legs and do this, but no, like I want to stay here. And we kind of just take a little glimpse at that. These skyjackers, though, they take a look at the void and they somehow see this image of like them with a bunch of money at the end of it. And so you have efforts to like build a fake airport in Florida that looks like the Cuban airport, like to fly, for these hijacked planes to fly to, and to trick they were so, ill-equipped to understand like the individual motivations that they would, not just like try to prepare these stewardesses and flight crews of like what to do if a hijacker is there, and what it is essentially is like do whatever he says and like just do whatever you can to get the plane on the ground and try to make him as comfortable as possible. And you start seeing almost this cultural attempt to make Americans kind of comfortable with this, that this is, we found like some reporting of like a Life magazine of like what to do if your plane is hijacked. And like, you could think about getting a nice Cuban cigar or bring some tropical clothes. Like there was this wonder of like, is this just going to be the like part of the risk of air travel? And if that is, then we have to like make it part of the culture and like get people interested in it. Like, could you get people like, excited for preparing for a possible hijacking the way that they bring like extra snow boots, on a trip to, and I think you start seeing some of that, but these actual skyjackings are both, they're just terrifying to the people who survive them. And you start seeing eventually they're not so fun anymore when people do get shot. They're not so fun anymore where people are trapped for tens of hours, or if your plane does go to Cuba, suddenly you're having to rely on Fidel Castro to let you go. And so this becomes just this untenable ball of terror that could happen on your plane, but also people wondering, could this be the thing that sets off the Cold War? Could this be the thing that Fidel Castro gets that permanently alters Cuba's relationship with America? What if hundreds of people died on a plane in Cuba? Like what, you start really seeing this spool of fear start to go out, and you start seeing the walls start to close in on like what actually has to happen to stop this.
Wait, not to go too into depth about it, but are these all happening to Cuba?
A lot of them are happening to Cuba, and it's again, it's hard to understand why, and it's also in the period of the mid to late 60s, in the you have this age called the golden age of skyjacking, and a lot of the early ones, maybe Cuba was like a main character of American media, and sort of, if you were someone who was worried about where the Cold War is going, if you were wondering if God has a plan for any of the great leaders in the world, if you were to be called on to somehow affect one of those leaders, who would it be? I think a lot of folks after the Bay of Pigs, and especially wondering like what is the nearest communist threat, they thought of Fidel Castro, they thought of Cuba.
Okay, let's put ourselves in the heads of the journalists at the time. Like, why do they think there's been this explosion in skyjacking?
Part of what stood out to me is that the late 60s, are such a politically and culturally momentous moment for this country. There are different causes. You have the Black Panthers, you have the aftermath of the civil rights movements, you have the assassinations of Martin Luther King and JFK, within a few years of each other. you have a great deal of people who are alienated and detached from stability, and this idea of grabbing national attention, of focusing everyone on one thing for just a little bit. And by the time you get to the skyjackers who are criminal, who are, seeking money, these criminals are using some of this cultural cachet, some of these references to, perhaps give themselves a disguise or show them, to make themselves distinct to others. You have, hijackers like Garrett Trapnell, who hijacks a plane in 1970, early 1972, who, demands a bunch of money, and he's after the money, but he also demands the release of Angela Davis, who's this activist. And he doesn't care about Angela Davis at all. He just thinks, oh, this is what people expect skyjackers to do. This maybe will get me a call with President Nixon. And so you have it in this, like, it feels like a regular crime where it's a danger, but it's not everywhere. But it's also a crime that has the opportunity of being everywhere. And so you really see this frustration and tension, and, by a lot of people, just an effort to treat it like a dramatic news story that just happens every few weeks. Another plane is hijacked. How exciting, isn't it? No one was injured. The hijacker was taken off. And there's a point where, could this just be the way we live? And it seems like there's a moment where that might be in the 60s and early 70s. But you also just start seeing a different kind of skyjacker come up after, like, a number of, people who are perceived as mentally ill, essentially having these high profile arrests. And once people start seeing that someone like DB Cooper could potentially make it out with a couple $100,000 and not kill anyone and, be kind of exciting, you see, I think it's something like 15 copycats of DB Cooper after 1971. You see fewer ideological or politically motivated skyjackings. They still exist, but you really start seeing a whole other sector of American ingenuity come into this. I think once there are a few violent incidents, and once the monetary incentive, once people kind of really realize, oh, people are going to keep hijacking planes because they think they can make money off of it. And I think that's when I think Americans and our institutions understand, if there is a monetary incentive to something, it's going to keep happening until you make a decision to alter it or decide that, this money shouldn't be made this way anymore. And that's what I think was the breaking point, and why DB Cooper and his successful escape with those couple $100,000 create, that was the worst possible thing that the FBI or these airlines could imagine. Maybe even worse than a plane blowing up is someone getting away with it.
Ooh. Yeah, no, because that's a precedent right there.
Because we could deal with tragedy. Like, there were many airline disasters like this, like the flights in the 50s and the 60s. And if you were flying in another country, the history of Russian airline travel is unbelievably gruesome in different ways, of the amount of crashes. I think people know how to deal with mass tragedies that are your Titanic hitting an iceberg. But it's much harder to deal with, like, someone successfully making themselves wealthy for the rest of their lives by perfectly pulling off this plan. And I think that's when you start to really worry that regular young people start thinking about that this could be something they can do.
Okay, so it wasn't just journalists noticing this phenomenon, right? Like, there were government officials.
The FBI was not happy with this, for sure. The FBI was very pressed to act and do something about these. And unfortunately, it kind of led to the sense of them trying to more aggressively respond. Toward the end of this era, you had a couple FBI shootings on these planes of when they would land. There was an effort by, for a while, skyjacking was a capital crime. You would be sentenced to death. And so, again, even if these were, hostage situations, there was a lot of pressure on agents and on, like, law enforcement to solve this, or to show such a aggressive response. They would brutally put one down and then make sure no one else would ever try hijacking because they know they would get full of holes by FBI snipers. This was not a good. This was, again, one of the things they tried before finally getting metal detectors and airport security and things that actually work.
How did government officials explain what was going on? Like, why was happening all of a sudden?
I don't know if there was a concerted sort of answer to why. I think you do start seeing like these psychological tests, the sort of relying on like the scientification, if that's a word, that's a word. Like we're gonna put our best eggheads on this. It is hard for me to imagine what it's like living in America in the mid to late 60s, of where the drumbeat of just the craziest news stories and technologies that have ever existed, space travel, Vietnam, assassinations, communism, the development of nuclear weapons, the development of technology like television. There was so much changing, and I think there was this sense that, and this is still a time where people have, to some degree, a great deal of trust in the government. I think you could, depending on where you were coming from, you could see skyjacking as evidence of communism taking root and chaos, but you could also see it as evidence that the U.S. government is failing to uphold its promises to its own citizens. You might just assume that this is part of life. It is a sign of just how badly these airline companies and others wanted to avoid security. They were going to do anything possible to physicalize this reality, that you need magnet detectors because we can't have people bring guns on the plane anymore. Yeah. We need to stop allowing people to just walk onto a plane and buy a ticket there. And you start seeing this unraveling, or this fear that this entire industry that was just really roaring, in the 20 years post World War II, could this end it all? Would people tolerate a change of this extent? Would it be admitting how much we screwed this up? And you see that a lot in kind of these negotiations that take place before they finally make metal detectors mandatory, in the early to mid 70s.
So back to the question of why. It sounds like there isn't an answer.
I wish I had something simple for you.
No, that's fine. I guess I'm interested in how you deal with that uncertainty. Like you go in, you report this out, you sort of try to get at that question, and you kind of keep getting clues, but you never get to an answer. How do you sit with that?
It is one of the, I think, ways that one could respond to this is by narrowing your focus. We got to look at one person. We've got to look at one year or one airline. Some of these skyjackers have talked about it, but some of them are trying to rehabilitate their own lineages. They're still performing. They've never stopped. And I think that is difficult as a journalist when you're talking with one of these folks who has been involved in an infamous crime or is trying to create their own new version, is suddenly you are in the position of you are their talent agent in a way. You are crafting their story for them. And you got to be really careful. And that was what I was very worried about when I did start getting into this reporting and talking with people who maybe had reason to want to feel self-aggrandized, to reburnish their image. But that's not always the truth.
All right. Well, thank you so much, teaching about the fascinating world of skyjacking.
Absolutely. Can I give you one bit of advice if you were ever to skyjack a plane?
I would love that.
You gotta know how to use a parachute. The skyjacking that I learned most specifically about, the moments that I always are the most wild to me, and the most that I don't know what it says about humanity, is that Martin McNally has never parachuted before. And part of his demands for this plane is that he wants his $500,000, but he also needs some parachutes. And he also needs someone to show him how to put on a parachute. But I hope maybe you'll have a better experience.
Oh, I'll let you know.
Yeah, I'll look for the sky. I'll look to the sky and I'll see your parachute gently floating down.